Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. In this lecture, we are going to discuss human resource security and incident handling. So, email and internet use since the early 2000s and up to now, it has been extended in most factories, most companies need to use the internet and need to exchange emails. So, for that reason, we have to have the development of policies that organize how emails and the internet use is allowed within those companies. So the reason that there is a need for a policy is due to the concerns regarding, first of all, work time that is lost, for example, because of surfing the web, that takes many hours, that might have the employees distracted from doing their job. Another example is computer and communication resources that are being consumed. And there is a risk from a security perspective, this is one of the important ones, is there is a risk of important malware because of the use of email and the internet, and there is a possibility of any harm, harassment, and any type of bad conduct. So some of the suggested policies in terms of the use on email and internet use is to have a business use only policy. And that means that when we have some data that we want this data to only be shared for business use, then we can label them as business use only. And some can be labeled as public, some can be labeled using different labels. So this is one of the suggested policy. Another policy is to have a policy scope, meaning what kind of access to email is allowed. Are you allowed to communicate with people outside of the company? Are you allowed to communicate with contractors? Are you allowed to communicate with only people within the company? So what are the policies that have you decided on your email in terms of scope? And in terms of internet and intranet use, so what is the scope? Are you allowed to have access to the internet at all, or is it just intranet access? And if you do have access to the internet, so what kind of access, to which level do you have access to the internet? And another suggested policy, especially in the digital age, is content ownership. So who has ownership to the files, to the data, to the information that you have been working on as an employee to this company? Obviously, because you're working at the company and during company working hours, you're getting paid. So all of the content that you're working on is going to be to the ownership of that company. So if you leave the company, you can't take your files, you can't take that data. It is belonging to the company. And privacy. So in terms of privacy should not be expected from employees towards their company. If you surf the internet, if you surf the web, if you're searching for anything using company devices, you should expect that these devices are going to be monitored. The history is going to be reviewed, and you shouldn't be expecting any privacy in terms of the property of the company. And the standard of conduct, this could also be a policy that is used, reasonable personal use. So that means that you can use the company property for personal use, but with reasonable amount. So for example, if you want to print a document that is of 1 page, 2 pages, then it is allowed, depending on the policy of your company, that you can use it for personal use. But for example, if you're printing a book that takes, for example, 200 to 300 pages, usually that's not allowed within the company policy. So there is going to be a section that says what is the reasonable personal use for company property. What kind of, for example, are you allowed to use the web for personal reasons? For example, you're going to book a flight. So this depends on the policy for reasonable personal use. Unlawful activity obviously is going to be prohibited. So for example, viewing websites that are not allowed due to the, for example, it violates the company policy or the government policy. And you should also expect to have a security policy, a company policy, company rights. So what are the rights of the company in terms of your work, and disciplinary action, meaning if you violated any of these policies, what is going to be the disciplinary action? Are you going to be terminated from your job, or is there going to be, for example, a cut in terms of your salary? So you should also look into the disciplinary action against violating one of those policies. So here is one of the main topics of this lecture: incident handling. The meaning of an incident is when we have an attack or a potential attack. We've discussed this in the previous lectures from a technical point of view. Now we want to discuss it from a business point of view. So when an incident happens, or in technical terms, when an attack happens or any violation or a possible threat, we call this an incident. When it's in a company setting, we call it an incident. So an incident is any violation or possible threat of a violation of a computer security policy, acceptable use policies, or the standard security practices. So an example of this, when a denial of service happens at a company, then we call this an incident. When malware is installed from a phishing attack that infects user computers, this is called an incident. When an attacker obtains sensitive data, for example, that reveals information about the CEO, this is an incident. When sensitive information of the company is being distributed using peer-to-peer sharing files, this is also an incident. So what do we mean by handling an incident? It means what are the business procedures that we're going to follow when this incident happens, when this attack happens. So incidents would not happen, obviously this I've been saying from week 1, if we had an infinite amount of security budget. If we have infinite security budget, we wouldn't have incidents because we would have purchased all of the software and hardware that we can to eliminate any possibility of an incident. But usually we don't have that infinite amount of budget, especially for security. So that is one reason that incident might happen. Another reason is that we also don't have an infinite amount of capable security personnel. We have a limited number of people that are going to be taking shifts and monitoring the devices, such as intrusion detection systems, such as log files, such as firewalls. So because we don't have an infinite number of people, each for each of those devices, each of those software that we use in this company, then we might have an incident. So because things can go wrong in spite of all of our best attempts, we call those that happen from a security perspective in a business setting an incident. So it is useful to develop a standard procedure to respond to incidents because we know that they might happen. There is a potential that they happen. So it is best that we have a standard procedure such that we don't react unrationally when they happen and decide what are we supposed to do, who are we supposed to call, who are we supposed to contact when this happens. So we should write a standard procedure and then refine those procedures based on our experience with time and typically business process improvements with exercise. So incident handling usually follows 4 main steps. So this procedure of incident handling follows 4 steps. The first step is preparing for an incident, meaning that what we do before an incident even happens, we prepare for it, and we're going to see the steps that we do in the preparation stage, and then detect and analyze. So this is when it first happens, when we detect it and analyze it. And then when we try to contain it, meaning isolate it from the network, from the devices, from whatever its environment is, and eradicate it, and then recover if we had, for example, any disruption in this information that we need to recover to an earlier state. And then finally we have post-incident activity. Usually this is a document that we write after this whole incident has happened, and we want to document what have we done, what was the best way to handle it, is there any comments from the incident responders that we could have done that we haven't this time but could have potentially helped us in the next time. So this is what we usually do in post-incident activity. So the first step is the preparation, and usually preparing for an incident is not an enumeration process. And what that means is that we don't list all the possible scenarios. So we're not going to write, if we have, for example, a malware on this software, this is how we're going to react to it. If we have a malware that is, for example, there are going to be names of different malware. If we have this type of malware on this software, this is how we're going to react to it. And if we have this and this is how we're going to react, because we have a lot of possibilities. Listing all of them is not reasonable. So listing all possibilities and writing all the appropriate responses to each of those scenarios is going to be very time consuming, and usually we're not going to be able to list all of them. So a more productive way is to identify the basic steps that are common to all events and plan execution of each of those steps. So that is what we usually do in the preparation. So these are the main tasks or activities during the preparation stage of incident response. And we also call them peacetime activities. The reason that we call them peacetime activities is because they happen before the incident happens. So we're at peacetime as an organization. And that is starting with writing an incident response policy. And that means that we have to discuss what is going to be our policy in terms of what are the rules that we're going to follow if an incident were to happen. And usually this is an opportunity for the incident response team, the technical team, to be able to talk to management and discuss with them what will we do in the case of this incident happening. So because usually management are not IT, so usually they don't have the technical knowledge. So when we write an incident response policy, this gives them an opportunity to understand better the way that we decide to do incident response. And then we have a full policy that also includes within the policy who is going to be the incident response team. And we're going to discuss in the upcoming slides who is going to be a member of the incident response team, how do they interact with each other. But this should be included within the policy. Who is going to be the incident response team, contact numbers of the incident response team, and we also might need a supporting team. The reason that we might need a supporting team is, for example, if we are a vendor of a software that other companies are using, or for example, the general public is using, and there is a malware on our software, then we might need legal action. For example, if it has information about credit card information, then this might have a implication on the general public or on the other companies that we're working with. So in that case, we might need legal advice. So we might need a supporting team. We might also need public relations in the case that we need to contact with the media, because usually the technical team are not the best at talking to the masses. So for that reason, we might need a supporting team that would be able to better send that message to the masses. And another activity is the incident communication, compliance. We need to know who should we be complied with in the case of an incident happening. And this is best done at the preparation stage, because when an incident happens, the incident response team is going to be focused on trying to solve this incident, trying to remove it, and they're not going to have the time to look at who should we be complied with, who should we contact, and who should we comply with other governmental organizations. And during peacetime is a good opportunity to know which hardware and software do we need to install, do we need to have at the company before an incident might happen, and obviously training, what kind of training the incident response team needs to have to be able to respond to any incident that might occur. So within the incident response policy, it is a description of what is going to be the standard method used by the organization for handling information security incidents. So what could be the benefits of having a policy? First, it helps focus on the incident as a whole from start to finish. So instead of when an incident happens, you start looking at it from that point and then trying to solve it one step at a time. When you have a policy, you can focus on the incident as a whole from start to the finish before it even happens. So you don't have to be diverted by the media and any organizational pressures. At that time, you already have a policy that tells you what you're supposed to do. Another thing is discussions provide the management with an understanding of an issue that may have to deal with during the actual incident. So, meaning that you can have the time to tell the management and educate the management on how incidents happen and what could possibly be a result of an incident. And it also impacts of the planned controls can be assessed by the stakeholders, may not be anticipated by the IT team. So some of the controls can be assessed by the stakeholders. For example, we need to add this control if this were to happen, and this allows the stakeholder to be part of the decision because it happened ahead of time. And it also reassures the users. When a user knows that there is a policy, there is an expectation of how to handle this incident, how to handle, for example, the spread of a virus, you're more at ease knowing that the people who are handling it know what they're doing. So it also provides a reassurance to the users. So the incident response team, who are they? They are staff that are designated to respond to the incident. So they are incident responders. Usually that's the job description that you'll find. What they do is that they develop experience over time about what is the expectation of the organization during the incident. Usually they're cross-departmental. They're not in the same department because we might need someone that knows how to respond to the types of attacks that happen on databases, someone else that has experience with operating systems, someone else that is experienced with, for example, a specific software. So we need them to be cross-departmental, and also managers have to spare them, the incident response team, when they are needed to handle an incident. So for example, if they're working on something else, because usually we don't have an incident every day, so they'll be working on other things at a day-to-day process. So when an incident happens, managers need to spare them because they are part of the incident response team. So what are the responsibilities of an incident response team? First of all, they need to be able to quickly identify threats to the campus data infrastructure. They have to be able to assess the level of risk. So for example, now that an incident happens, they have to assess the risk that could potentially happen from this threat, this incident specifically. And they need to be able to take immediate steps to mitigate the risk. They need to be able to notify management on a timely manner of the event and the associated risk. They might also need to be able to notify the local personnel of an incident involving their resources. So for example, if this attack happens on a certain software that is owned by a team or a division in the organization, this team needs to be notified so that, for example, they need to take their, for example, they need to do their business requirements in a different location, or they need to, for example, transfer from one software to another software. They might need to use their backups instead of using the current system. So they also need to notify the local personnel of any incident that involved their resources. They also need to issue a final report that includes the lessons learned. So this is part of the post-incident activity that they need to finally, after the end of any incident, they have to be able to issue a final report that shows everything that they've done and what were the lessons learned. For example, during this incident, it could have been better if they did this procedure, but for example, because of the time constraint, because of the resources, because of whatever reason, they couldn't do it at this incident. But we know now that this should be what we do during the next time. So the roles of each member of the incident response team must be part of the incident response policy. So this is what I mentioned in the previous slide. So within the incident response policy, you should mention all of the names. It should mention all of the names of the incident response team, including what are they going to be doing, what is their specific task, or what is their role, and some contact information about the incident response team. Usually a large organization may need multiple incident response teams, especially when it's cross-continental or has multiple cities. So we could have an incident response team in each of those cities or in each of those continents. So one within each division of the organization, and then we'll have a central group decided when events start crossing boundaries between those incident response teams. So usually a incident response team is composed with one chair. Usually this chair has the title of a senior security analyst. And the responsibilities of that chair is that they will be able to communicate and coordinate with the external stakeholders. They need to be able to help the incident response team members to perform their functions, so they have to have the technical skills. And they need to have high credibility within the organization because they need to trust them, so for competence. And they have to have excellent communication skills, both oral and writing, because they need in writing they need to write the report, oral to be able to communicate with the management. And they also need to have enough technical background to understand the situation, to respond to it well, and to help the other incident responders during their functions. And they also have to have good judgment to make split-second decisions, educated decisions based on the status updates. So for example, what should we do now? We have a malware that is spreading. What should be our next action? So they have to have split-second decisions to be able to mitigate those risks. And now with technical team members of the incident response team, we don't use all of them. When we've selected the team members and we've written their names in the policy, each of them has a role. We don't usually use all of those members, but the members that we need for this specific incident. So for example, if we have a Oracle database that was breached due to a compromised administrator account on the operating system, so the incident response team may include someone who's familiar with the operating system that is used. Let's say it's a Linux operating system, so we're going to talk to someone of the incident response team that was mentioned in the policy that has the role of dealing with Linux operating system. So we'll call this person. We'll also call a person who is familiar with databases from the incident responders. And we might need a network engineer because usually this is connected. So we might also call someone who is a network engineer from the incident response team, and a desktop service personnel if desktop machines were facilitated in this attack. So who did the incident response team interact with? So they have multiple stakeholders. One of those stakeholders are the customers, the media. So the incident response team also need to communicate with them. They also have to be able to communicate with the direct customers and the media. And they also need to communicate with the software and support vendors, especially when this attack that has happened to this organization, for example, it is dealing with let's say, an Oracle software that most businesses use. And this malware was spread on this Oracle software. So this company who uses this software might need to contact the vendor, which is a different software company, which is, in this case, let's say it's Oracle. So they might need to communicate with them because they might have seen this attack, and they will tell us how to respond as an organization. They will, for example, tell us that this software, yes, we've seen this attack is happening on, for example, multiple of our software, and this is how this is the procedure that we'll follow, and we advise you to follow it as well. So the incident response team at a company might also need to contact the software and support vendors to have advice about how to handle this type of malware that happened using their software. And they also may need to communicate with law enforcement agencies. For example, if they're going to punish someone because they know this person who is responsible for this attack, so they need to communicate with the law enforcement agencies. They might also need to communicate with the law enforcement agencies if they're dealing with, for example, sensitive data that requires the incident response team to be complied with this agency. So they might need to communicate with them. And other incident reporters, so for example, we might need to report this incident. They need to communicate with them, and internet service providers such as SEC Mobile, because they can help them in finding the people who are responsible for this attack. And other incident response teams, especially when it crosses borders from one incident response team to another incident response team, there might need to be communication between them. So the supporting team. Now, we've already said that the communication is an important aspect of the duties of an incident response team, and an incident response team must resist the temptation of conveying speculation as informed expert opinion. Obviously, this written in paper and on a slide seems obvious, but it is tempting for people to usually convey information as informed and expert opinion while it's just gossip. So any incident responder should avoid the temptation of giving out information. It should be following a need to know principle. So people are only provided with the information that is necessary for them to perform their job. And when we need a supporting team, it is when we need to communicate with the general public. So in that case, we might need media relations because they could help us with experience, because they have more experience in dealing with the media. We might need legal counsel. We might need the law enforcement for government to cover any credibility. And we must, as an incident response team, minimize rumor mongering and any ill-informed publicity and general disorder. So the communication of an incident response team, we have inbound communication, meaning people who are communicating with the incident response team, and outbound communication, meaning who the incident response team need to talk to. So who should be notified when an incident happens? Obviously, it's the affected people. So inbound communication, meaning how would we know as an incident response team that we have an incident? It could be by a direct report, meaning that the owner of this asset is going to tell us that we're finding something that is unusual with the software or hardware that we're dealing with or the network. So any observation of an unusual computer behavior, such as, for example, the devices that we're dealing with are too slow today, slower than usual, or that we're, for example, seeing that our data are encrypted. So a direct report, meaning that the owner of this asset is telling us directly that we are finding something that is unusual with our IT infrastructure. It could be an anonymous report. And why would we have an open forum for an anonymous report? Because the owner could be hiding some information or not trying to give out this information because it might look bad for his reputation. So an anonymous report gives the ability to subordinate employees to give out this information and help in responding to an incident when it happens. So another inbound communication could be from the help desk, because at any company, the responsibility of a help desk is that they will respond to any technical difficulties that any employee might face. So usually this is the first hotline that they will communicate with the help desk. So the help desk, when they're overwhelmed with many problems relating to something specific, because of this unusual problem that they don't know how to solve, that they're not familiar with, they might contact the incident response team that we're seeing something that is unusual. Could you help us with this? So they can discover that there was a misconfiguration, for example, of a shared network drives. And this can be communicated with the incident response team, and they will be able to deal with this situation. It could also be a self-audit. So the incident response team are required to continuously audit and continuously do an examination it depends on the organization, it depends on the policy, but it could be an annual audit, it could be a biannual audit. So during that audit, during that examination, they could find vulnerabilities and then respond to those by their self-audit. So for example, we can find that we have a forgotten FTP process, and this forgotten FTP process that we forgot to close is now being used as an MP3 file server for someone anonymous. So this is one way of knowing that we have an incident. So these are the different ways that we can find out that an incident has happened. And now, who does the incident response team need to communicate with when an incident happens? Obviously, they need to communicate with the affected people. So whoever is affected by this incident, they need to know. The way that they need to know is on the basis of how much information should we tell them for them to be able to do their task. So IT personnel and the help desk, because we need to tell them the amount of information that is needed. And the reason that we need to tell the IT personnel and the help desk is because people are going to overwhelm them with these questions. So we have to tell them, for example, at least how long do we expect to be working on this system. For example, if this system is down because we figured out that there is an incident, there is a malware, we at least need to tell the IT help desk that this is going to be taking a while. For example, it's going to take 5 hours. Any user should expect that this is not going to be working. So they need to know this kind of information. So immediate updates to remove any exploited vulnerabilities can be also shared with the IT help desk. And we also need to inform managers and other executives periodically, because they are the management. They're the ones that are making the decisions. So they need to be informed even if nothing has changed. Because some employees, some would think that I'm not going to notify management until something requires their action. But telling them before anything happens is a better approach, because when you're overwhelmed, for example, with a lot of tasks where it requires you to analyze this malware, to understand this malware better, to know where did it start from, and to know how much has it spread. If during that time management finds out that there is a malware that is spreading and you're actively doing this, you might be overwhelmed with the tasks that you have, and you might fall through with mistakes. So you should notify them as soon as you know, even if nothing has happened, even if it hasn't spread enough, even if it didn't ruin any of your devices yet. They need to know, because it keeps them at ease. So instead of when it happens, they have to do a phone call that is, for example, half an hour, 1 hour, that you could have used as an incident responder with mitigating this risk, you're wasting it on this communication. So it prevents any distracting phone calls to engineers working on containment and eradication of the problem. And quick text messages with brief email messages with a status update could be adequate. And obviously end users and customers. So for example, if this company is, let's say it's YouTube, or it's Google, or it's one of those big companies that end users deal with them directly. So usually they want to know if, for example, YouTube is going to be down for a whole day. They want to know this information, if it's going to affect their work, if it's going to affect their jobs. So usually end users should also be informed when something happens, and you should tell them, especially these questions. For example, when will the system be back? What has happened? What has happened is on a need-to-know basis usually. Compliance. So in compliance, now we're back to the peacetime activities. So during peacetime, meaning in the preparation stage, we also need to know who are we complied with. So as an organization, who should we be complied with? Because knowing ahead of time if any incident were to happen, who should we contact and who do we have an obligation to tell is very important, because doing it during the incident means that you have to look up some documents while you also want to analyze this incident. What has happened? How is it spreading? What should we do next? So doing all this at the same time is going to be time consuming, and you might have to pay a penalty because, for example, you were not compliant, because compliance could be in the first hour of knowing that an incident happened. So if we don't prepare for an incident and we don't know who should be complied with, and an incident does happen, and only at that time do we decide to look up who are we supposed to be complied with, then we might be in compliance. So compliance basically means that it is the act of following all the applicable laws, the regulations, the rules, the industry codes, and the contractual obligation. And in practice, often it's important mainly because non-compliance leads to avoidable penalties. So we need to comply with incident response requirements applicable to your context. So as an example, When a known or suspected loss, theft, or compromise of PII, meaning personally identifiable information, involving the US Navy system, then the US Navy system has to be complied with doing the following. So they have to use this form to make an initial and a follow-up report. They have to send a form, US CERT, within 1 hour of discovering the breach. So if 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours pass, then they're in compliance. They're non-compliant. And they also need to report to this office within an hour. They need to report to the Defense Privacy Office. They need to report to the Navy and other offices, and they have to follow the chain of command as applicable. So knowing this ahead of any incident, knowing who should we be complied with, helps us in avoiding any penalties due to non-compliance. And also during preparation, we need to know what are the hardware and what are the software that are needed for the incident response. And to be effective, the incident response team need all of the appropriate tools. That includes backup devices. So for example, if we are now looking at a device that is compromised because of a malware, we need backup devices to create a disk image and other incident data, because we need those backup devices to know which state have we looked into last. So we need backup devices for that. And we need the laptops for gathering, analyzing, and writing reports. And there should be spare computer hardware that are crash and burn, meaning that you can use them only once to do the malware analysis. Because usually when a malware happens, in most cases, these are going to be new to the incident response team, meaning they want to learn and understand the extent of this malware. So to try them, it is usually being tried on not on company devices, but on those spare devices that can. It is okay if they're ruined. It is okay if they're destroyed due to this malware, and it's isolated from the network. And we also need packet analyzers to capture and analyze any traffic that could be causing this incident to happen. Digital forensic software, because if, for example, there's some data that has been deleted, we can recover those erased data. We can analyze any of the modified and access and create a timeline of how did this incident happen, where did it start from, and do this understanding and create a final timeline. And doing any log analysis. Evidence gathering accessories. So evidence gathering meaning when not only do we care about during this incident response process, we don't only care about recovering the state of this organization in terms of business procedures, but also we want to know who's responsible for this, for example, for this incident. For example, it could be an attack. So evidence gathering means we want to gather as much evidence as we can if we know someone that is a suspect of this attack, and we gather as much evidence as possible, and we can use digital cameras for that, we can use audio recorders, and we can also use chain of custody forms, which we'll see in the next slide. And also that could be very useful that we have search engines. So having connectivity to the internet and having access to search engines could also help the incident responders in knowing the latest, for example, attacks that could happen. And for example, when you see the device that has been infected, it includes a log snippet or an FTP banner that might reveal some valuable information. You can search that and then you can find extra information or other incident responders that have seen this before. So even in the training, is done during preparation, meaning that the awareness of the baseline set of information that is required for the security. So anyone who's working at an incident response should know and have training on access control, telecommunication, network security, information security, governance and risk management, software development and cryptography, software architecture and design, and including all of this security technical training that they need. They also need other facets of training such as media relations, because sometimes the supporting team that is supposed to be working with the PR are not available, or for whatever reason you have to be the one who talks to the media, or you have to be the one who talks with the management. So you need to have some training in media relations or PR trained. So all these tasks are of the first stage, of the preparation stage. So next, we're going to look at the detection and analysis. And now is when an attack has happened, when an incident has happened. And this is where we start the documentation. This is where we start documenting that an incident has happened, and we write everything that has happened afterwards. So in the documentation, we will have a record for the organizational memory. It facilitates the post-incident analysis to improve the response process. So we start during the detection and analysis, and it ends with the post-incident analysis. So just to clarify what that means, is we said here, this is when we start the documentation process, because this is where an incident actually happens, and then this is where we have our final report in the incident, post-incident activity. So the detection, we have different methods for detecting that an incident has happened. And obviously analysis means that we want to identify the damage, the extent of that damage. Now looking first at the documentation, because this is where we start the documentation. So the NIST recommendations for the minimal information that we include in the documentation is we need to understand what is the current status of the incident, because we might not be the only team that is viewing this document. So we need to write, is it new? Is it in progress? Has it been forwarded for investigation? Has it been resolved? And we also should include a summary of the incident, so that when we need to read about this incident again, if it happens again, we need to review this file. There is a summary of this incident, and there are indicators related to the incident, so we know if these indicators happen in another incident. And what were the actions taken by each of the incident responders? A chain of custody, if it was applicable. We're going to talk about the chain of custody in the next slide. And the impact assessment related to the incident. What was the impact of this incident on the organization as a whole, on the technical infrastructure? What was the impact? And contact information for other involved parties. So who was the system owner? Do we have the contact information? It should be documented. The system administrator. These should also be documented. And the list of evidence gathered during the incident investigation. All of the evidence that we gather should also be included. And comments from the incident handlers, for example, if we've done this, but we should have done this but we couldn't do it this time. And these are the lessons learned. So these comments should also be included in this documentation. And all the next steps that should be taken. For example, after we've finished the incident, we should then rebuild the host. We should upgrade this application. These are all should be included within this documentation. So now we've talked about the chain of custody in many previous slides. So what is the chain of custody? Now, when we handle an incident, we not only want to go back to a state where business is running smoothly, but we also want to find out who is the person responsible. And usually a company wants to take them to court. And there's only one way for a trial to be done against someone, knowing that evidence hasn't been tampered, is by following the chain of custody. And that means that when you collect evidence about, for example, a past employee that used to work on APC, that used to have these flash memories, there has to be an evidence and a timeline in a document that shows that you haven't tampered with any of the information. So the way that this is handled is, first we have to collect evidence. And collecting evidence could be, for example, if you're dealing with a past employee that has been using their emails, that has been searching online, for example, about a malware that they decided to install, then you can't open their device and do these searches manually. You have to copy it into a disk image. That is the first thing that an analyst will have to do. Because if you search on their device, then you're tampering with evidence, because now nobody can tell if these searches were yours as the analyst or these were the searches of the original employee. So first, collection. You have to collect evidence by first creating a disk image of that device, and then you can search from that disk image. And then you can look at the previous history, you can look at the emails from this disk image, not with the original evidence. And then, so the second step is examining the evidence, trying to look for information, then you analyze them. So when you examine multiple different sources, such as the email, the web history, for example, the files that they've downloaded, then in the analysis stage, you can analyze this information and build a case. And then at the end, you will report this information and it will be taken to law. And it has to include a timeline of when each of these things has happened. So then the second stage is the detection stage. And the detection methods, we have multiple different methods. So how do we detect that an incident has happened in our company? First way, and the easiest way, is when we see any visible changes to the services. So if you remember from previous lectures, we've seen an example of website defacement. So this is obvious when anyone logs into a website that has been defaced. This is obvious just by looking at it that this system has been attacked. So this is one way of detecting that we have been facing a incident. And secondly is performance monitoring. So for example, you realize that your device today or the server today is extremely slow compared to every other day. So that could be because, for example, there's a file or there's a process that is being run on the background that is causing this excessively slow processor. And this process can be a malware. So we can look into that and we can find out that we have an incident. And there's also another way of personally identifiable information, such as your IP address, emails, and monitoring of those. So for example, you can use tools such as Google Alerts to see if your IP addresses, see if your email, to see if any of your personally identifiable information have been on their search engine. So that is one way to know that there has been leaks, for example. And also from file integrity monitoring. So if you remember from chapter 2 or chapter 3, when we discussed hash functions, and we mentioned that we can use hash functions to continuously check if our files and our programs have been modified maliciously when this hash value is different from the one that we have stored. So hash file integrity monitoring is also a way of detecting any incidents, and it can be in a host-based IDS. And we can also receive an anonymous report, such as someone from within a subunit telling us that there is an incident in their unit. And we can also, by analyzing the logs, we can discover that we have an incident from any endpoint protection alerts, such as any malware protection that we have, host IDS functionality, and finally from an internal investigation, such as we're investigating someone and then we realize that there is an incident that is going on from looking at the IT infrastructure. So now that we detected that we have an incident, we should analyze this incident. And it begins with the incident detection. So when we discover any adverse event that composes the incident, we have to manage the second step afterwards, which is the containment and eradication. And usually we want to avoid containment without analysis. And that is because, let's say that we have a virus that has been spreading over the network. We usually want to avoid containing it, meaning isolating it early before analyzing. And the reason for that is because we want to understand first what devices has this virus affected. I don't want to, for example, take out this device or shut down this device and isolate this other device one by one, and then only after I realize that it has been spreading over the whole subnetwork. And we could have, if we took the time, we could have realized that it affected the whole subnetwork and just disconnected the subnetwork so that it doesn't go to another subnetwork. So that is the reason usually analysis is done before containment. And we can also have help during the analysis stage from internet search engines. such as looking at an FTP banner, some port numbers that botnets are usually using for searches. We can, during the analysis stage, also have to identify who are the stakeholders, who are the owners of these devices that we're going to shut down, for example, that we're going to disconnect from the network. We also have to identify restricted or essential assets that are affected by the incident. So not only do we care about understanding the malware specifically, but we also need to understand at this incident who is going to be affected. And who do we need to call? Who do we need to contact? Who are we supposed to be in communication with in the case of this incident? Because we need to make some decisions later. So after we've analyzed the case, after we understood how, for example, what is the extent of this virus or this malware, and we know how far it has reached, and what we need to do next is we have to contain it. And the containment is the act of preventing the expansion of the harm that is caused by this incident. So it typically involves disconnecting the affected computers from a network. It may involve some temporary shutdowns of services, for example, closing down one of the services, two of the services, depending on how many services are being run on that device. So we have to be careful. Sometimes, but it's not the norm, but sometimes containment is necessary before analysis. And one reason for that, because the usual flow is we will analyze and then contain. But there are some cases where we might need to contain before analysis. And one of those cases is, for example, when I know for a fact that our information as a company or personally identifiable information are being leaked from a single port, then I want to shut out that port. I want to close that port from it being spread over the internet. So if I know information is being leaked, usually I'm not going to wait to understand what other regions could this leak be caused from. I want to close this, and then if there is other ports that cause this leak, I want to close them as well. But if I know for a fact that there is one place where personally identifiable information or confidential information is being leaked, I want to close it, as opposed to other situations such as a virus that is spreading. Because when a virus is being spread, I want to understand how far has it spread before I start disconnecting, because it's going to take a lot of time and it might still be affecting other devices if I contain before analyzing. So if the analyst is confident that ongoing events merit an action, then we can contain before completing the analysis, especially when the risk is too high to first analyze and then do the containment. So it's usually, this decision is largely determined by the experience of the incident response team. And as an example, if we have, for example, a backdoor that is being used to actively transfer personally identifiable information to off campus, then usually we will try to close that down. So incident containment is a very important step to get the stakeholders' input as much as possible. Why? Because we want to prevent any other incidents. So for example, if the HR system are now doing payroll, and now we know that there is a malware on that device that they're doing the payrolls within, so if we just disconnect it without telling them about it, they might be within transactions. And if we disconnect it without notifying them, they won't have record, and there could be another incident that, for example, if we shut it down, they don't have a record of who did they pay and who did they not pay. And this is a big deal in terms of an organization's HR system. So it might interrupt payroll processing if performed at the wrong time. So we have to notify people so that they can take an extra action, so they can, for example, decide to do this later, or we might have to wait. So they have to be informed because it will prevent other incidents. And other judgment calls during the containment stage is, well, if the device or the software that is being affected is not very important for the organization, but this attacker's activity is very interesting and new to us that we want to learn from. So there could be a judgment call from the analyst to sit back and observe the behavior of the attacker, but obviously this has to be from a analyst that is very experienced to be able to wait and observe and then take an action, because it would damage assets if it was to a device or a software that is important. So the incident response team members and administrators have to be careful when we pull the plug on hackers. So now that we know, for example, now during this moment, as an incident response team, we know that the hacker is actively on our system. The way to deal with hackers at this point is we don't want to, for example, close every service one by one, because hackers can be very destructive when they know that they're being when they know that the analyst knows about them. So the way that we should approach it is with an FBI sting operation. So such as the movies, when the FBI all come at once to the criminal's door and with all their guns. So this should be the similar approach that an analyst should follow. So they shouldn't, for example, block them from one service and then another service and then another service. If they have access to, for example, 4 or 5 services, they shouldn't block them one by one, because when you block them sequentially, they start to realize that their actions are being known. And when they realize that their actions are being known, because they want to be as far away from suspicion as possible, they're not going to leave without doing any destruction. They're usually going to, instead of, if they don't know that the analyst knows about them, where they're going to do their attack and then remove their tracks by removing just the record of their actions, they're going to delete the whole log file. And if they delete the whole log file, it might be destructive for the organization even more, because not only does it not tell them who the attacker is, but it also, this log file could have helped them at other stuff. So hackers can be destructive when they know that they've been found out, and they might remove all local logging information that may lead to their capture in an effort to cover their tracks. So the way that we should approach it is using an FBI sting operation. So this just shows the steps followed in the third stage, which is containment, and then eradication, and then recovery. Then the third stage is after you contain and isolate the device, you eradicate the malware or whatever is causing this incident, and then you use the backups to recover the deleted files. And then the final stage is post-incident analysis. So in post-incident analysis, the incident response team are going to prepare for a next incident. So they'll gather all of their notes. They're going to finalize their documentation about this incident that has happened. So the documentation should contain all of the individual adverse events that were involved in this incident. So usually this comes together with a timestamp and all of the assets that were involved, including the areas of the organization involved in this incident and the resulting breach, how threats were handled by each individual of each department, and together under the coordination of the incident response team, and the extent to which the existing procedures were appropriate. Did we handle them well? Was there a better way to handle it? What were the opportunities for improvement? The extent to which assets were appropriately identified and classified. Did we identify them well? The assets that were affected by this incident, was there assets that we didn't realize that were affected by this incident that we should have? Did we classify them well? So this all should be documented. And the extent to which information sharing with the stakeholders was done satisfactorily. So did we communicate well, or did we lack in the communication? What were the opportunities for preemptive detection? So instead of detecting them at the time, were there any opportunities to preemptively detect so we could avoid similar issues from happening? And what were the technical measures necessary to be taken to avoid any similar issues in the future? So all of this should be documented at a single document, so that whenever a similar incident happens, they already have a documentation and they know all of the steps that have been done by the incident response team at the time. So now we move to a a similar topic, which is disasters. So disasters, it is a calamitous incident that causes great destruction. So it has a huge repercussion throughout the whole organization. It involves usually multiple sub-incidents, and the way to deal with it is with a disaster recovery plan. So, for example, the COVID-19 was a disaster because it not only affected one area of an organization, it affected the whole operation of that organization. Because of this disease, we had a whole change in operation that affects the whole organization. So, for example, at a university, we usually give our lectures in class. We usually give our quizzes in class. You usually have to present in class and do your project in group in class. So all this had to change during COVID. So usually it involves multiple sub-incidents. And what we usually have to do so that we better deal with those disasters is to have a disaster recovery plan. So it is a process that is adopted by the IT organization in order to bring systems back up and running. So the primary objective in this case is to keep the employees and their families safe. Because as I said, it doesn't only have to affect the IT infrastructure. It could affect people. So for example, COVID-19 affects people and their families. So the primary objective when we want to do a disaster recovery is to keep the employees and their families safe and do implementations that avoid hazardous situations. So it may involve moving operation to a redundant site, recovering services and data. So for example, if a company's main headquarters catches a fire, then in this case, we might move to a redundant site and recovering services and data. So it's an extremely complex process. It's not easy. It's not something that a freshman would do, a fresh grad, sorry. So it is usually tackled by individuals with very much a lot of years of experience in the organization. And another example of a disaster is in 2002, a hardware failure caused all 30,000 students' emails accounts to be lost. So just keep in mind this was 2002. So maybe today this wouldn't be called a disaster because we have multiple different means of social media, but at the time, email was the only means of communication online. So having an email, submitting projects, sharing files was all done through email. And even mobile phones were not accessible to everyone at the time. So to that organization at that time, it is considered as a disaster. So the disaster recovery plan at the time was that since we need students to be able to have their emails up and running and we need them to communicate with their professors and their colleagues, so the disaster recovery plan, because we can't do this process all at once, the first thing we'll do is we'll give them all access to emails that are empty. So we're not going to be able to do the recovery of past emails and give them emails that they can exchange information with and communicate all at the same time. So first we'll give them initially empty emails that will allow them to send new and receive new emails, and then subsequently all mail data will be extracted from tape, meaning from backup devices, and restored to the user's mailbox. And the entire process took 3 weeks. So disaster recovery is a piece of a bigger picture, which is business continuity planning. And disaster recovery is related with recovering from the disaster. Business continuity is more generic. It is how to maintain operation under those adverse conditions. So the planners contemplate what would happen in case of a disaster and what would be minimally necessary to help the organization continue to operate even during the disaster. So business continuity planning includes not only recovering from this disaster, but what can we do as a business to try to continue business during these adverse conditions. So using the USF email example that we've seen in the previous slides, continually activities involved questions on how students would turn in their assignments. So this would be part of the business continuity planning. Is that, for example, are we going to do another means for students to submit their assignments instead of through email? This would be how do we continue business
until we fix that failure. So business continuity planning and disaster recovery involve and are often led by entities that are other than IT. So as the case in COVID, this is not led by the IT department because it doesn't only affect the IT infrastructure. So it can be led by other departments such as the HR, where they may require all individuals to stay at home, for example, if a case of a hurricane. And IT may need employees to physically be present to shut down some machines. So usually it's a coordination between these groups that will ensure the appropriate actions are performed. So usually a disaster will have a preliminary checklist that includes the call list, who do we call in case of an incident, the plans to inform fellow employees in local phone systems are down. So for example, if the local phone system, because of a heavy rain, for example, or a hurricane that caused the local phone system not to be working, how do we communicate with our employees? So there should be a backup idea to instead of communicate with them using the local phone system. What are the plans that we have to sync backups and recovery at local and remote sites? Which data should be restored first? So in the case of a disaster, all of our IT infrastructure is down. All of it is not working. What should be restored first? This should be in our disaster recovery plan so that we don't make that decision at the moment, but we can make it ahead of time. We know which devices, which servers should be restored first. Training for data restoration. So are there instructions published somewhere for data restoration? Do we know how to restore data? Or do we have to read a 100-page manual? And we also need to make some tests for the restoration. So for example, tapes and other media can go bad, can be scratched, and can become unreadable. So we have to do those tests to ensure that our backups are actually going to work when we reuse them. And we also have to ask, are there means to acquire new hardware to quickly replace the hardware that has been damaged? So do we have insurance with a company that will provide us with, for example, 100 devices if there was a fire, if there was any reason for our devices to go down or be distracted? So we have to know this. So if a cyber insurance is involved, does someone know how the details of how to activate it? How do we activate this insurance? How do you communicate with them? Who exactly are we expected to communicate with? So in all likelihood, you will not get disaster recovery responsibility in the early part of your career, and that is why it is not covered in detail within this book and this lecture. But you have to familiarize yourself with the basic concepts so you can contribute to the process. And thank you so much.